Welcome to Module 2, Social Tools Examples. In this module, we're going to talk specifically about lesson strategies for using 4 different social networking technologies, and then explore examples for how you might choose to use this in your own teaching and learning, particularly for K-12 virtual education. Once again, we're going to assume that you want to teach students at a distance and that you're working with students 13 and over, because our example technologies require students to be at least 13 in order to have an account. Now, there are ways to work around that, but I encourage you not to unless you have some very explicit permission from the school, from the parents, and the students themselves. So really, let's just focus on students that are 13 and older and using these technologies. So the first technology we're going to talk about is Google+. And in fact, in this course, you've all experienced a Google+ environment aligned to this series of courses that we're teaching around virtual education. Now, Google+ can be really valuable because it's a generally public environment, although you can have private communities, as the one you're experiencing, and it has a whole host of tools that can be integrated into it. So everything from YouTube, which will automatically post to Google+, to your Gmail, to using Google Hangouts directly from Google+. There's lots of benefits to the Google suite of technologies, many of which are designed to support K-12 virtual education, or K-12 education in general. So it's very valuable in its style as a collection of tools. Although, as we'll talk in a minute, that can be challenging because there are a variety of different tools that you can utilize, and that can be overwhelming. And then finally, Google+ tends to be a fairly either slow or very quick kind of tool. So either students will slowly post and slowly communicate, or there'll be a whole lot of activity in Google+ at one time. There's never sort of this even pace. There might be, depending on how you set your projects, but usually it's more of a every now and then you'll check it, or we're using it as a way to reflect particular work that we're doing, and we're going to use it in a very time-situated example. Now, some pros and cons for using Google+. Google+ is great for connecting all of those multiple tools. And Google has done a really good job at streamlining its account process so that usually if you have an account in one tool, it'll just allow you to have an account in all of the other Google tools. It's also very community-driven, and it connects with Google Classroom, which is specifically for creating classroom environments for teachers in an online space. There's a lot of permissioning. It's complex in some of the permissioning, but it's super flexible. So you can really dig into privacy and get a sense of where and when would you want to have private spaces, and who would you want to have run those private spaces in your classes in order to ensure that the right kind of experience is happening and that your students are protected. And as I mentioned before, Google does have an emphasis on education, and so there are some really good resources that Google has created on how to use it in education, particularly K-12 education. And there's quite a bit, because it's a free suite of robust tools that other K-12 educators have produced. So you've got a lot of resources that you can use when thinking about possibly using Google+ in your virtual education. On the downside, as I mentioned before, there's some complexity in the suite of tools. So because there's so many of them and there's so much you can do, sometimes that can be overwhelming to both you as an instructor facilitating that experience, but then also to your students participating in that experience. And then it's also can be challenging because most students probably haven't ever used Google+. It's more of an adult technology, Google+ in and of itself, and so it may be challenging in helping students understand how and why they might actually want to use it. Well, speaking of the how and whys, I've got a couple sample lesson ideas for you in thinking about using Google+ in your class. On the asynchronous side, you could use Google+ or even Google Pages as portfolios. I've actually seen this done really nicely, where students will collect resources and references as they're developing a project, and then even post parts of their project. And because it supports multimedia really nicely, video through like a YouTube or other video tools, you can have links to articles, you can have images, audio snippets. Because it does that really well, you can have a nice, easily created portfolio that students are developing. It's also great for some collaborative activities, although depending on how you structure them, you need to make sure to encourage students to go back and participate. So I definitely suggest that if you're going to use it in a collaborative setting, that you do it in such a way where students are, I don't want to say required, but compelled to want to participate, because since Google Plus isn't in their normal lexicon, they may not come regularly back to be a participant. You'll probably notice that yourselves with our Google Plus community. Another great example for using Google Plus asynchronously is using it for a group project management tool. So a place where if groups are working together to develop a project or to solve an issue, be a great place where they can, since they're all virtual, come together and share the resources, the references, the work that they've done as they're working to develop that project or solve that problem. So it can be a great sort of collection tool that everybody can access and everybody can use. It also could be used as a questions and feedback space. So if you didn't want to use a traditional asynchronous discussion, you could use a Google Plus page as a place where students would post their questions prior to an exam or questions that they're having with particular content. And then other students could go and answer or give feedback if they wanted to throw out ideas. Now on the synchronous side, you could use Google Plus as a wrapper for a guest speaker that presents in Google Hangouts or Google Live on Air. So it could be a nice wrapper, a place where everybody's preparing before the speaker, where you go and you actually launch into the speaker because it will post an announcement directly in Google Plus of when you have a live session, and then where students would then follow up with reflections or ideas or notes or other resources from that guest speaker. So it could make a nice wrapper. The next technology that we're going to talk about, a social networking technology that probably many of us have used, is Twitter. Now Twitter, from a privacy perspective, can actually be more locked down than I think most people realize. You can actually limit who sees your posts or who follows you in Twitter to select people. So you could have it so that your students could limit them only to following each other and not so that the whole world could follow one of your individual students. You could also make it public if you wish, or create very synchronous sessions, which we'll talk about in a second, where they're public for just a small duration of time. From a style perspective, for those of you that use Twitter, know it's very short. It's 140 characters or less. It's generally simple ideas. You can embed links to URLs, to videos, to images, to other resources in a Twitter post, but it won't necessarily appear directly in that post depending on the tool that you're using. So it's kind of short commentary, quick ideas. Many of us often use it when we're at conferences or in other event-driven places where we want to have up-to-date reflections or ideas. The pace can be quick. And this can be overwhelming for people. So Twitter can move very fast and things can get lost very easily, or it can move very slow depending on how engaged your audience might be and what you have to say. Now some pros and cons to Twitter, and we've kind of hinted at some of these. Twitter is really great for moments where you're exploring the world around you and you want to give quick sound bites. So those conferences that we do. I always think about that. Let's say you had a student or you had your students attend some sort of event or a speaker or a presentation or watch something and they're all doing it at the same time. Twitter could be a great place where they're reflecting on what they're seeing and hearing. Twitter is also great for places where you want to make just a real quick observation or you want to give quick feedback or quick ideas. It's more about presenting out. And so when you have lessons that are about presenting out as opposed to discussing and debating and having dialogue, Twitter could be a great tool. On the downside of Twitter, things, as I mentioned before, can get lost pretty easily because it can move quickly, particularly if you're going to do things in a public environment. Lots of people are using the same hashtags in Twitter, and if you don't know what a hashtag is, it's how you can search against various topics. A lot of people are using those, so things can get diluted really easily. Not a lot of students 13 and up have experienced it. Twitter, you see college-age students use it more than high school-age students. So that could be another drawback. Students may not be familiar with how to use Twitter and may not understand how to be so quick and concise in some of their thoughts. And then finally, the limited characters do limit how much you can say. So thinking about situations where limits is good and not bad would be the most valuable. Speaking of those situations, some sample lesson ideas for using Twitter in an asynchronous way would be to, once again, as I mentioned before, have students reflect on some sort of activity they're doing outside of class. Perhaps you're having your students go to the local science museum, and you want to have them make comments as they're seeing different things or interacting with exhibits in the science museum. Well, Twitter could be a great place for them to do that. And it could be something where you create a fairly complex or not easy to grasp hashtag, kind of like my Emerging Trends MOOC hashtag, and that you have all students attach that hashtag, and even if they go at different times, they could be following what their fellow classmates observed when they went at different times. It's also a place where asynchronously you could have students be preparing for their next day, either an exam or an assessment or an activity or presentations, and they could be posting reflections as they're getting prepared, a way to be thinking more consciously about how are they studying and preparing for something in addition to just doing the actual studying and preparing. This helps them as a lifelong learner, and it helps them develop a more critical thinking and reflective skill. You could also do some just-in-time quizzing if you wanted to. Throw out a question and see who answers, especially if they're following you as a teacher and it's a very limited following situation. And similarly, you could do that synchronously. Or you could have guest speakers or other synchronous presentations or activities happen in Twitter. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but it could be something that's real simple and clean that you can do very quickly in Twitter and have that be in a certain time period. We're going to do live Twitter chats in an hour time span, and we're going to answer questions in that time span in a synchronous fashion. That could be a good example of how you may want to choose to use it. And then finally, it can be a great place for brainstorming activities. Once again, if you keep it very limited, you have a very specific hashtag, and people are following in a time period, it can be a great way to just throw out ideas or throw out references or suggestions for resources for people to look at in a very quick fashion. Now, our third technology that we're going to talk about is Pinterest. So Pinterest, probably not familiar with your students, but a really interesting visual tool for people to use. And this is the one in past iterations of this class, most people say, I'm excited to try to use Pinterest with my students. The cool thing about Pinterest is, for those teachers out there that teach younger than 13 and have hung in there, you could use Pinterest as a teacher to visually develop and share collaborations and never have to have students log in or create an account. So this is one that you could use for kids under 13 because they could publicly see your board and never have to make an account. So some basics around Pinterest. It's generally a public site, however you can have private boards, which is awesome because then you can share it with just a limited number of students. You can have, or students can share with just a limited number of their colleagues. It's very visual. It's about images, kind of like a collage board, and the pace tends to be slow but fairly even. People will tend to use it as a collection tool. Not usually a synchronous tool, although you could, but more of a collection tool over time. So some pros and cons to using Pinterest. On the pro side, you can use it for art-oriented, visually oriented activities. I remember growing up always having collage activities where you'd bring in magazines and you'd cut pictures and you'd glue it on pieces of paper so that you could visually grasp concepts. It's an important skill for students. Well, Pinterest is a great place to do that visually grasping of ideas. It's also a great place for aggregating resources and annotating. It teaches annotation because you need to put annotations, or you don't have to, but you can, on all of the things that you contribute. On the downside, students aren't as familiar as we've talked about, and it's not really focused on writing. It's more about this collection of other people's stuff, this visual collection. So there may be situations where it just doesn't fit because you want to focus more on the writing. Well, speaking of where it might fit, on an asynchronous perspective, you could use this for ways for students to create very art-oriented projects or design-oriented projects that need to be very visual, and they could submit a board to you as that visual project. It'd be great for helping students to understand digital literacy and how to gather resources and then appropriately annotate valuable resources. And finally, it gives students a way to visually express ideas and to collaborate around that. You could have student groups create joint boards where a part of their assignment is to create a Pinterest board that maps the ideas of something that they're developing. I did this recently in a course I taught where students were creating a new technology, and I wanted them to go out and identify visual aspects of that technology or values of that technology and create a Pinterest board around them. It helped them solidify what they wanted that technology to be and not to be, and really gave them a visual connection, not just a verbal or written connection to what they were trying to accomplish. On the synchronous side, it's not generally used in this way, but you could do it for brainstorming. It could parallel students creating a group project, and you have them in an hour collect as many resources as possible associated with that project. And it could even be used as a way to have students come together as a class and design something for a community project or larger project that they may be doing. Now, the last technology, we've talked quite a bit about Facebook, so the last technology we'll probably move pretty quickly through, but it's Facebook. And yes, you can use it in education. We know that in Facebook, it's generally public, but you can have private groups that are limited only to very specific people, and there's lots of privacy settings set around that. There's no limited length. Facebook tends to be, can be visual and writing oriented. People like to share and reflect in Facebook, and the pace can be slow but even. It's generally more of an asynchronous environment than synchronous environment. Now, Facebook can actually be great for making observations about the world around you and sharing ideas, getting feedback, reflecting, commenting in the moment, and asking for help. So even in this class, you'll see that some people will choose to participate in our Facebook page, and in that space, you'll see ongoing conversations from students from past sessions asking for ideas from their colleagues. On the downside, Facebook tends to be very personal, and your students probably have used it at some point, if not currently using it. Because of that, it's easy to get shifting unexpectedly from personal to learning back to personal, so you have to be very careful with that. And students may feel too casual in the Facebook environment. So you have to sort of set some parameters around how they should be interacting. Now, some sample lesson ideas. On the asynchronous side, you have the ability to develop projects and have students then show the iteration of those projects and even reflect on those. You could ask them to do research activities or even do some questions and answers or coaching or mentoring, all within the Facebook environment. It's also a great place for people similar to using like a Google+, to do pictures and capture the world around you and then comment on that and make that sort of this activity of reflection. You also can, on the synchronous side, if you wanted to do something synchronously, use it alongside field trips or visits to labs or other hands-on activities, maker activities, things like that. You could use it alongside that, similarly with Twitter, but now in this case you could easily put images, do little videos, or commentary. Now let's just take a moment to think about what we've talked about, and in particular apply this in this case to your own teaching. Think about where in your teaching it might be most valuable for students to socialize, particularly around a project probably, or an activity or an event. And how might you use one of the social technologies to make that more impactful or to help students be more reflective or dive deeper into that particular experience?